Poor deaf wife unexpectedly regained hearing, but caught her husband cheating with her sister. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories, where love, life, and lessons come alive. May your hearts be wrapped in peace, your paths illuminated with purpose, and your days overflow with boundless joy. Life is a precious gift, and each moment is a treasure waiting to be cherished. Together, let's celebrate the beauty of today and the promise of tomorrow. Today, I want to share something that resonates deeply with my soul. 30 years ago, on a day forever etched in my heart, January 16th, I met the most extraordinary woman, my wife, Binta Peter, a proud black queen. Her love has been my anchor through storms, my guiding light in darkness, and the greatest treasure of my life. She is my forever, my muse, and my reason to dream. Family, we are on the brink of something truly magical. 10,000 followers, just 400 more to go. And we have only one day left, but I believe in the power of this incredible community. Your kindness, your support, and your love have brought us this far, and I know we can make it happen. Let's make her smile even brighter, because she deserves the world. How did the last story touch your heart? Your thoughts and feedback are the heartbeat of this space, so don't hesitate to share in the comments. Now let's embark on today's journey together, hand in hand, with love and hope guiding the way. You are loved, you are valued, and you are part of this beautiful family. Let's make magic happen. The morning sun painted shadows across Arabella Blossom's classroom at the Southside Chicago Deaf Community Center, her sanctuary for the past 3 years. Her slender fingers danced through the air as she arranged the chairs in a perfect semicircle, each movement precise and purposeful. At 25, she had mastered the art of creating order from chaos, of finding beauty in the silence that had been her companion since birth. Arabella paused at the window, her reflection catching her eye. Dark, lustrous skin glowed in the early morning light, and her intricately braided hair, done by her mother's careful hands every Sunday, framed a face that spoke of both strength and vulnerability. Her eyes, deep pools of amber, held stories that her voice had never told. She smoothed down her royal blue dress, a stark contrast against her skin, and smiled at her reflection. Today felt different, though she couldn't explain why. The community center had been her salvation after college. When other doors closed because people saw her deafness as a liability, Ms. Jackson, the center's director, had seen potential. "Your hands speak poetry," the older woman had signed during Arabella's interview. "Our students need someone who understands their world from the inside." Those words had changed Arabella's life. Teaching ASL to both deaf and hearing students gave her purpose, a way to bridge the gap between her silent world and the cacophony of sound that surrounded her. Each student brought their own story, their own reason for wanting to learn the beautiful language of signs. Some were parents of deaf children, others were social workers or teachers, and occasionally someone would join simply out of curiosity. The first warning bell vibrated through the floor. Ms. Jackson had installed special vibrating panels throughout the building to mark class times. Arabella's students would arrive soon. She loved these moments of anticipation, watching the empty chairs slowly fill with eager faces, hands ready to learn the dance of silent communication. Sarah Chen always arrived first, a hearing mother determined to connect with her deaf son. Then came the Martinez twins, both interpreters in training, their fingers already flying in conversation as they walked through the door. Regular faces, familiar stories, the comfortable rhythm of her daily life. But today, that rhythm skipped a beat. He walked in exactly 3 minutes before class was scheduled to begin. Tall, with skin the color of rich coffee, and shoulders that filled out his charcoal grey dress shirt in a way that made Arabella's hands pause mid-sign. Their eyes met, and for a moment the silence in her world felt electric. His name was Gary Kirsten, she would learn later, a construction company owner who had won a contract to renovate several buildings that served the deaf community. He wanted to learn ASL to better communicate with his clients, he explained through written notes, his handwriting surprisingly elegant for someone with such strong hands. Arabella assigned him a seat in the front row, acutely aware of his presence as she began the lesson. His eyes never left her hands as she demonstrated basic greetings, his brow furrowing in concentration as he mimicked her movements. There was something endearing about the way his large fingers struggled with the delicate signs, like a sculptor learning to paint miniatures. During the practice session, she approached him to correct his form. Standing behind his chair, she gently adjusted his fingers into the proper position for "nice to meet you." The brief contact sent a spark through her hands that had nothing to do with static electricity. Gary turned his head slightly, and his smile made her heart perform a complicated gymnastics routine. The 2-hour class passed in a blur of motion and stolen glances. When the final vibration signaled the end, Gary lingered, carefully writing out a note. "Would you be willing to give private lessons? I'm a quick learner, but I want to make sure I get everything right." Arabella should have said no. The center had policies about private instruction, liability concerns that Ms. Jackson took seriously. But something in Gary's expression, a mixture of determination and hope, made her fingers move before her brain could object. "Tuesday and Thursday evenings, after my last class," she signed, then wrote down for him. His smile could have lit up the Chicago skyline. That decision marked the beginning of what Arabella would later call her awakening. Their private lessons became a dance of discovery, not just of language, but of each other. Gary's dedication to learning ASL impressed her. He practiced constantly, his fingers growing more confident with each session. He brought a notebook filled with questions, his curiosity about her world genuine and deep. During their third private lesson, he surprised her by signing a complete sentence without hesitation. "Your eyes speak louder than any voice could." The compliment made her blush, but it was the accuracy of his signs that truly touched her heart. He had been practicing, probably for hours, to get it just right. Their relationship evolved naturally, like a flower turning toward the sun. Gary began arriving early for their sessions, bringing coffee, he learned her order by heart, vanilla latte with an extra shot, and pastries from the bakery down the street. They would sit in comfortable silence, sharing breakfast and trading written notes about their days. She learned that he had built his construction company from the ground up, starting as a laborer and working his way through night classes to get his contractor's license. He told her about growing up on the West Side, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. His stories were full of struggle and triumph, matching her own experiences in ways that made her feel less alone. In turn, she shared her own history, the challenges of growing up deaf in a hearing family, the frustration of well-meaning relatives who never quite learned to sign properly, the joy of discovering the deaf community in college, finally finding people who understood her world without explanation. She told him about her dreams of opening her own school someday, a place where deaf children could learn without feeling different or less than their hearing peers. Their conversations, whether signed or written, had a depth that Arabella had never experienced before. Gary didn't treat her deafness as something to be overcome or pitied. Instead, he seemed fascinated by her way of experiencing the world, often asking questions about how she perceived things differently. The first time he asked her out on a proper date, he did it entirely in ASL. His signs were still a bit clumsy, but the effort he put into the invitation moved her deeply. He had arranged for an interpreter at the restaurant, ensuring they could communicate freely throughout the evening. That night changed everything. Over candlelight and perfectly cooked steaks, they shared their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Gary's hands moved with increasing confidence as he told her about his plans to expand his business into specialized construction for deaf spaces, creating environments that were both beautiful and functional for the deaf community. When he drove her home, the Chicago skyline twinkling behind them, he didn't need signs or written words to express his feelings. His kiss spoke volumes, soft and sure, like a promise written on her lips. His hands cupped her face with a gentleness that belied their strength, and in that moment Arabella felt truly seen. Their courtship bloomed like a garden in spring, each day bringing new discoveries. Gary threw himself into deaf culture, attending events at the community center even when they weren't together. He made friends with her students, practiced signing with anyone who would engage with him, and slowly but surely became a familiar face in her world. The community center became their special place. After her classes ended and the hallways emptied, they would often stay late into the evening. Gary would practice his signing, each day growing more fluent, while Arabella taught him the subtle nuances of facial expressions that were so crucial to ASL. Sometimes they would turn on music, not for the sound, but for the vibrations that Arabella could feel through the floor. Gary would take her hand, and they would dance, moving to a rhythm that transcended hearing. Their first "I love you" happened in that very classroom 3 months after they met. Gary had been practicing a particularly complicated sign sequence, his frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. Arabella moved to help him, and when their hands met, he pulled her close instead. His fingers spelled out the words against her palm, and then he signed them properly, his eyes never leaving hers. Arabella's response was immediate and tearful, her hands shaking as she signed it back. That night, as they sat on the steps of the community center, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, Arabella realized that silence had led her to the loudest love she'd ever known. Gary's presence in her life filled every quiet moment with meaning, every gesture with purpose. He proposed 2 months later, on a rooftop garden he had built himself. The space was filled with lights that pulsed in patterns spelling out, "Will you marry me?" In ASL. He had thought of everything, the vibrating floor that would let her feel the music he had chosen, the way the lights reflected off the glass walls to create a magical atmosphere, and most importantly, the small gathering of their closest friends and family, all ready to share in their joy. As Arabella looked around her classroom now, preparing for another day of teaching, her engagement ring caught the morning light. The diamond wasn't large, but it was perfect, just like the man who had chosen it. Gary had insisted on having "Love Speaks in Silence" engraved on the band, a testament to their unique journey. Their wedding was 3 weeks away. Arabella smiled, running her fingers over the smooth surface of her desk. Soon, this classroom would hold another story, the beginning of their life together. She couldn't hear the world around her, but her heart was full of music, a symphony of love composed in silence and played in the language of hands and hearts. Little did she know that this beautiful silence would soon be broken by the loudest betrayal of all. Chapter 2. Passionate Promises. The setting sun painted Chicago's skyline in shades of amber and rose as Gary carried Arabella across the threshold of their modest apartment. Wedding bells might have been ringing somewhere in the city, but in their world, the silence was filled with promise. Her white dress, simple yet elegant, whispered against the doorframe as they entered their newly shared home. Their wedding day had been a beautiful fusion of deaf and hearing cultures. The ceremony featured both spoken words and flowing signs, the officiant working in tandem with an interpreter to ensure every guest could share in their joy. Arabella's vows were signed with such grace and emotion that even hearing guests who didn't know ASL found themselves moved to tears. Gary had practiced his signed vows for weeks, determined to speak to his bride in her language on their special day. Now, in the privacy of their apartment, the rest of the world fell away. Gary set Arabella down gently, his strong hands lingering at her waist. The last rays of sunlight filtered through their window, casting a golden glow across her dark skin. She looked up at him, her amber eyes filled with love and anticipation. They had waited for this moment, choosing to make their wedding night their first time together. Gary's fingers moved with practiced grace, signing against her skin. "You are more beautiful than any dream," his hands told her, each movement a caress. Arabella's response was to reach up and trace the line of his jaw, her touch feather-light but full of meaning. In their world, touch was its own language, and they were both fluent in its dialect of desire. The apartment around them had been transformed. Earlier that day, while they were at the ceremony, their friends had decorated the space. Dozens of LED candles created a warm, flickering atmosphere, a safe alternative to real flames that still captured the romance. Rose petals made a path to their bedroom, and subtle, vibrating panels had been installed in the floor, ready to translate music into rhythmic pulses that Arabella could feel. Gary reached for his phone, starting a playlist they had created together. As the bass notes began to pulse through the floor, Arabella closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm in her feet. Her body swayed naturally, and Gary pulled her close, one hand at the small of her back, the other tangled in her intricately braided hair. They danced slowly, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization. The kiss began softly, a gentle press of lips that quickly deepened into something more urgent. Gary's hands moved from her hair to her face, cradling it as though she were made of precious glass. Arabella's fingers found the buttons of his dress shirt, working them open with delicate precision. Each new inch of skin revealed became a canvas for her touch. Their path to the bedroom was unhurried, a dance of discovery and anticipation. Gary paused at the threshold, his hands moving in the dim light. "I promise to love you in every language," he signed, before sweeping her into his arms once more. Arabella's heart raced as he laid her on their bed, the vibrations of the music below creating a rhythm that seemed to match her pulse. The process of undressing became its own form of communication. Each button undone, each zipper lowered, was accompanied by tender touches and meaningful glances. Gary took his time with Arabella's wedding dress, his careful movements showing reverence for both the garment and the woman wearing it. When the dress finally pooled at her feet, she stood before him in delicate white lace, her skin glowing in the LED candlelight. Arabella's hands moved to his chest, exploring the strong contours she had admired but never touched this way before. Gary's body responded to her exploration, his muscles tensing and relaxing under her fingers. She could feel his heart racing beneath her palm, its rhythm telling her everything his voice couldn't. Their first time together was a symphony of sensation. Gary had researched extensively about making love with a deaf partner, learning the importance of maintaining eye contact, using touch as communication, and being aware of vibrations and movement. His dedication showed in every caress, every kiss, every moment of connection. He took his time exploring her body, learning its language. His lips traced patterns on her skin, while his hands signed endearments against her flesh. When he found particularly sensitive spots, he paid careful attention to her reactions, building a map of pleasure that needed no words to navigate. Arabella discovered that her inability to hear only heightened her other senses. Every touch felt magnified, every kiss electric. She could feel Gary's breathing change through the hands she kept on his chest, could read his pleasure in the tension of his muscles and the expression in his eyes. Their lovemaking became a dance of give and take, each partner learning and responding to the other's needs. When they finally joined together, the moment was more profound than either had imagined. Gary kept one hand intertwined with hers, spelling out "I love you" against her palm as they moved together. Arabella's free hand rested over his heart, feeling its racing rhythm while their eyes remained locked in silent communication. The vibrations from the music below added another dimension to their passion, creating a baseline rhythm that they could both feel. Their bodies moved in harmony with it, finding a natural synchronization that transcended the need for sound. In the silence of their love, they created their own music. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets, their skin cooling in the night air. Gary's fingers traced lazy patterns on Arabella's back, sometimes forming words, sometimes just drawing abstract designs. She nestled against his chest, feeling the gradual slowing of his heartbeat, more content than she had ever been. They spent hours exploring each other, taking breaks to feed each other fruit and champagne, sharing kisses that tasted of strawberries and promises. Gary used his hands to tell her stories of their future. Signs painting pictures of the children they would have, the home they would build, the life they would share. Each promise was sealed with a kiss. Each kiss led to more exploration, more discovery. In the early hours of the morning, when the LED candles had dimmed to a soft glow, they finally surrendered to sleep. Arabella drifted off with Gary's arms around her, his fingers still spelling sweet words against her skin. Her last conscious thought was that she had found something rare and precious, a love that didn't need words to be understood. The weeks that followed their wedding night were filled with similar passion. They couldn't keep their hands off each other, finding every excuse to touch, to connect, to express their love physically. Their apartment became a sanctuary of intimate moments and tender discoveries. Gary proved to be an attentive and passionate lover, always putting Arabella's pleasure before his own. He learned to read her body's responses with remarkable accuracy, understanding what each subtle movement and expression meant. Their physical connection deepened their emotional bond, creating a harmony that seemed unbreakable. They developed their own intimate sign language, special signs that held meaning only for them. Simple touches that could communicate desire, love, need, or playfulness. Their friends teased them about their constant physical connection, but they didn't care. In their world of touch and sight, their love was a constant conversation. Their mornings began with gentle caresses and sleepy kisses, often leading to passionate encounters. Before work, evenings were spent discovering new ways to please each other, their creativity knowing no bounds. Even simple activities like cooking dinner became sensual experiences, with stolen touches and playful gestures leading to abandoned meals and renewed passion. Gary's construction business began to thrive, and he surprised Arabella with little gifts: silky nightgowns that felt wonderful against her skin, scented oils for massages, soft blankets for their intimate moments. Each gift showed his thoughtfulness and dedication to their physical connection. 1 month into their marriage, Gary presented Arabella with a special gift, a custom-made vibrating platform for their bed that could sync with music or create its own rhythms. The tech was designed specifically for deaf couples, and it added a new dimension to their lovemaking. Arabella was touched by his continued efforts to enhance their intimate life. Their physical connection seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. They explored every aspect of each other, learning what brought the most pleasure, what created the deepest connections. Their love life was a perfect blend of passion and tenderness, wild abandon and gentle devotion. Even at the community center, where they maintained professional boundaries, their connection was evident. Students commented on how they seemed to move in sync, their bodies naturally oriented toward each other even when they were across the room. Their love was a visible force, drawing others into its warm glow. But amidst all this passion and promise, tiny cracks were beginning to form, invisible fault lines that would eventually shatter their perfect world. Gary's touch sometimes carried a hint of guilt. His kisses occasionally tasted of secrets. Arabella, lost in the bliss of new love, didn't notice these subtle changes. How could she suspect betrayal when every night was filled with such seemingly genuine passion? The arrival of her sister Bronwyn would soon change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. For now, they remained wrapped in their cocoon of newlywed bliss, their bodies speaking a language of love that seemed eternal and true. As Arabella fell asleep that night, wrapped in Gary's strong arms, she could feel his heart beating against her back. Its rhythm seemed to spell out promises of forever, each beat a vow of fidelity and love. She drifted off secure in the knowledge that she had found her soulmate, unaware that the man holding her so tenderly would soon prove that even the most passionate promises could be broken. The chapter of pure love and passionate promises was drawing to a close, though Arabella couldn't hear the final pages turning. Soon, the symphony of their love would be interrupted by the discord of betrayal, and the silence she had always known would be filled with unwelcome truths. Chapter 3. Sweet Deception. 6 months into their marriage, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm for Arabella and Gary. Their small apartment had become a haven of love and understanding, each room holding memories of shared moments and passionate encounters. The morning sun would filter through their curtains, catching the dust motes in its golden beams as they went about their daily routines, their movements synchronized like dancers in a well-practiced performance. That peaceful rhythm was disrupted one rainy Tuesday evening when Arabella's phone buzzed with an urgent text from her sister Bronwyn. The message was brief but desperate. Need to talk. Marriage over. Can we meet? Arabella's heart clenched at her sister's pain. Despite their differences growing up, the bonds of sisterhood ran deep. They met at their favorite cafe, where Bronwyn's tear-stained face told the story before her hands could form the signs. Her marriage to Marcus, a successful attorney, had crumbled under the weight of his infidelity. The irony of her sister's situation wasn't lost on Arabella. While she lived in a world of silence, Bronwyn had been deafened by her husband's lies. The decision to offer Bronwyn temporary shelter came naturally to Arabella. Growing up, Bronwyn had been one of the few family members who had truly embraced sign language, learning alongside Arabella with dedication that matched Gary's. While others in their family relied on crude gestures and written notes, Bronwyn had wanted to speak to her sister in her own language. Gary's reaction to Bronwyn moving in surprised Arabella with its enthusiasm. "Family supports family," he signed, his movements confident and sure. "We have the spare room. She can stay as long as she needs." His generosity made Arabella fall in love with him all over again. Bronwyn arrived the following weekend with 3 suitcases and a broken spirit. At 32, 2 years older than Arabella, she had always been the more conventionally beautiful sister, lighter-skinned, with loose curls that fell past her shoulders and curves that turned heads. Now that beauty was dimmed by sadness, her usual confident posture replaced by a defensive hunch. The first few days were a period of adjustment. Their small apartment felt smaller with 3 people sharing the space, but they made it work. Bronwyn took the spare room, which had been serving as Gary's home office. He moved his desk into the living room without complaint, saying the change might help him be more productive. Bronwyn threw herself into being helpful around the apartment, perhaps to justify her presence or simply to keep busy. She cooked elaborate meals, cleaned obsessively, and insisted on contributing to bills despite her limited savings. Her presence added a new energy to their home. And initially, Arabella was grateful for the change. The first signs were so subtle that Arabella dismissed them entirely. A lingering touch as Gary passed Bronwyn the salt at dinner. A private joke shared over morning coffee while Arabella was in the shower. The way Bronwyn's eyes followed Gary when he moved around the apartment, tracking him with an intensity that went beyond casual observation. Gary's behavior shifted too, though the changes were equally subtle. He began working later hours at the construction site, citing a big project that needed extra attention. When he was home, he was more demonstrative than ever with Arabella, his touches more frequent, his signs more flowery, with declarations of love. If sometimes his kisses tasted of guilt, Arabella was too consumed by his increased affection to notice. Bronwyn started taking evening classes at a local community college, saying she needed to rebuild her life with a new career. Her schedule often matched Gary's late hours, both of them returning to the apartment within minutes of each other, slightly disheveled and full of stories about their respective days. The apartment's atmosphere began to change in ways Arabella couldn't quite define. There was an undercurrent of tension, like static electricity before a storm. Sometimes she would enter a room and find Gary and Bronwyn quickly stepping apart, their expressions carefully neutral. They would explain they had been discussing dinner plans or household repairs, and Arabella would nod, ignoring the way her stomach tightened at their proximity. One evening, Arabella came home early from the community center, a migraine forcing her to cancel her last class. She found Gary and Bronwyn in the kitchen, standing closer than necessary while preparing dinner. They didn't notice her at first, and Arabella watched as Bronwyn laughed at something Gary said, her hand resting on his arm for a moment too long. When they finally saw her, they jumped apart like guilty teenagers. Though their explanations were perfectly reasonable, they were just cooking, just talking, just being family. The dynamics of their home life grew more complex. Meals became a careful dance of conversation, with Gary mediating between the sisters more than necessary, given Bronwyn's fluency in sign language. He seemed to take special pleasure in translating for Bronwyn, though she was perfectly capable of signing for herself. His hands would move with extra flourish when conveying her words, his eyes lingering on her face as he signed. Arabella threw herself into planning for her upcoming cochlear implant surgery, using it as a distraction from the growing unease in her home. The procedure offered hope of entering the world of sound, of hearing Gary's voice for the first time. She spent hours researching, attending consultations, and working extra classes to build their surgical fund. Gary's support of the surgery seemed oddly enthusiastic, almost desperate. He accompanied her to every appointment, asked detailed questions about the recovery process, and constantly reminded her how amazing it would be when she could finally hear. His enthusiasm should have been touching, but something about it felt off, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. Bronwyn's reaction to the surgery plans was more complex. She expressed excitement for her sister, but often followed up with warnings about the challenges of adjusting to sound, the potential complications, the ways it might change Arabella's life and relationships. Her concerns seemed genuine, but there was an undertone to her signs that Arabella couldn't quite read. The physical intimacy between Arabella and Gary remained intense, perhaps more so than ever. Their lovemaking took on a desperate edge, as if Gary were trying to prove something with each touch, each kiss. Sometimes Arabella would catch him watching her afterward with an unreadable expression, his hands tensed as if holding back words he couldn't bring himself to sign. Late one night, unable to sleep, Arabella went to the kitchen for water. She found a wine glass in the sink, stained with Bronwyn's signature red lipstick. Next to it was Gary's favorite whiskey tumbler, the ice barely melted. The sight of those two glasses, clearly evidence of a late-night conversation she hadn't been part of, sent a chill through her that she couldn't explain. The next morning, both Gary and Bronwyn had perfectly reasonable explanations. They'd had a nightcap while discussing Bronwyn's job search. They'd wanted to let Arabella sleep since she had an early class. Everything they said made sense, and yet something felt wrong, like a sign made with slightly incorrect hand placement, close enough to understand, but off enough to notice. Bronwyn's presence began to affect Arabella's perception of her own marriage. She found herself watching Gary more closely, noting how his behavior changed when her sister entered a room. His signs became more animated, his smile more frequent, his body naturally orienting toward Bronwyn like a flower turning toward the sun. The apartment itself seemed to be conspiring against Arabella's peace of mind. The walls were thin enough that she could feel vibrations from the guest room late at night, suggesting Bronwyn was awake and moving around. Sometimes these vibrations coincided with Gary's trips to the kitchen for water, their timing too perfect to be coincidental, yet too subtle to question. Gary's construction business continued to thrive, bringing in more money than ever. He began buying gifts for both sisters, jewelry for Arabella, a new laptop for Bronwyn to help with her classes. His generosity was touching, but something about the equal distribution of his attention felt wrong, like he was trying to maintain a balance that shouldn't have needed maintaining. Bronwyn's presence had another unexpected effect. She began to serve as a bridge between Gary and the hearing world in ways that should have been unnecessary. She would offer to make calls for his business, attend meetings as his interpreter, despite him having used professional interpreters before. Their collaboration seemed natural on the surface, but carried an intimacy that made Arabella increasingly uncomfortable. The preparation for Arabella's surgery became a focal point of household conversation. Gary and Bronwyn both offered support, but their enthusiasm felt performative, as if they were acting roles in a play rather than expressing genuine excitement. Sometimes Arabella would catch them exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking, their expressions carrying messages she couldn't decipher. One afternoon, Arabella came home to find Bronwyn wearing one of her dresses. A simple mistake, she claimed. Their laundry had gotten mixed up, but the way Gary's eyes had lingered on Bronwyn in that dress, the slight flush that rose to his cheeks, sent warning signals through Arabella's body that she tried desperately to ignore. The signs continued to accumulate like snowflakes, each one tiny and seemingly insignificant, but building toward an avalanche of truth that would eventually bury their carefully constructed happiness. Arabella found herself starting to doubt her own perceptions, wondering if she was seeing betrayal where there was only innocent friendship, suspecting deceit in normal interactions. Gary's touch still spoke of love. His signs still promised forever, but something had changed in the grammar of their physical connection. His kisses seemed to carry questions instead of answers. His embraces held a tension that hadn't been there before. In their most intimate moments, Arabella sometimes felt like he was somewhere else, his mind wandering even as his body went through familiar motions. The surgery date drew closer, bringing with it a mix of hope and anxiety. Arabella dreamed of hearing Gary's voice, of knowing what sound accompanied his beautiful signs. But increasingly, she found herself worrying about what else she might hear once the silence was broken. In quiet moments, when she was alone in their bedroom, Arabella would stare at her reflection and try to read her own expression the way she read others' faces during sign language conversations. She saw worry there, and fear, and something else. A growing awareness that the sweet deception unfolding in her home would soon reach a bitter conclusion. As the chapter of their lives drew to a close, the weight of unspoken words and hidden truths hung in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Arabella stood on the threshold of a new world, one where silence would no longer protect her from the harsh realities of betrayal. The surgery that promised to break her silence would also shatter her world, though she didn't know it yet. In the meantime, life in the apartment continued its careful dance of deception. Gary's kisses still tasted of promises. Bronwyn's signs still spoke of sisterly love, and Arabella's heart still wanted to believe in the perfect life she thought she had built. But beneath the surface, truth was stirring, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be able to contain it. Chapter 4. Stolen Moments. The Chicago summer heat wrapped around the apartment like a thick blanket, but inside, a different kind of warmth was building. Gary's passion for Arabella had intensified to an almost fever pitch, their nights filled with an urgency that both thrilled and puzzled her. What she couldn't know was that these moments of increased ardor often followed his secret encounters with Bronwyn, guilt driving him to prove his devotion to his wife. On this particular evening, Arabella had just returned from teaching her advanced ASL class at the community center. The apartment was dark, except for the soft glow of candles, a romantic gesture that was becoming increasingly common. Gary greeted her with desperate kisses, his hands signing promises against her skin. The passion in his touch was genuine, even if the motivation behind it was tainted. Hours earlier, while Arabella was teaching, Gary and Bronwyn had shared their own stolen moment of passion in the very bed he now shared with his wife. The sisters' different schedules had created perfect windows of opportunity, turning the apartment into a stage for their betrayal. Each time Gary swore it would be the last. Each time the promise lasted only until the next opportunity arose. Bronwyn had become expert at timing these encounters. She knew exactly how long Arabella's classes ran, down to the minute. She had memorized the slight squeak of the third step on the stairwell that would warn of her sister's approach. Their affair was a carefully choreographed dance of deception, performed in the shadows of what had once been a happy home. But now, with Arabella, Gary's touches were filled with a different kind of intensity. Perhaps it was guilt that drove him to be more attentive, more passionate, or perhaps it was the thrill of his double life, the excitement of forbidden love, making his legitimate relationship more intense. Whatever the reason, Arabella found herself swept away by this new wave of passion, interpreting his desperate need as deeper love. Their lovemaking that night was particularly intense. Gary's hands moved over her body with practiced skill, spelling out endearments that felt like burning brands on her skin. "You're my everything," he signed between kisses, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue, even as Arabella melted into his touch. Her responses were pure and genuine, each caress a testament to her unwavering trust in their love. In the afterglow, as Arabella drifted to sleep, Gary lay awake, his conscience waging war with his desires. The weight of his betrayal sat heavy on his chest, but the thrill of his affair with Bronwyn had become addictive. He told himself that he loved Arabella, and in his way he did. She was his perfect wife, beautiful, talented, devoted. But Bronwyn offered something different, the forbidden fruit that tasted sweeter for being denied. The next morning brought another carefully orchestrated performance. Bronwyn emerged from her room just as Gary was preparing to leave for work, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. Arabella, focused on preparing her lesson plans at the kitchen table, missed the loaded glance between her husband and sister. These morning exchanges had become their secret language, a brush of hands while reaching for coffee mugs, a lingering look over breakfast, subtle signs that spoke of their illicit connection. They had become expert at these small deceptions, these tiny betrayals that accumulated like grains of sand, slowly burying the foundation of Arabella's marriage. During the day, while Arabella taught at the community center, Gary often found excuses to leave his construction sites. Bronwyn would call in sick to her waitressing job, and they would meet in hotel rooms, or sometimes, more daringly, in the apartment itself. Each encounter was followed by elaborate cleaning rituals, erasing all evidence of their betrayal. The affair had begun innocently enough, or as innocently as such things can begin. Late-night conversations while Arabella slept, shared laughter over inside jokes, the gradual erosion of proper boundaries. Bronwyn's vulnerability after her divorce had drawn Gary's protective instincts, and protection had slowly transformed into possession. Their first kiss had been a mistake, both claimed afterward. It happened one evening when Arabella was at a deaf community event. They had been drinking wine, discussing Gary's concerns about the upcoming cochlear implant surgery. Bronwyn had placed her hand on his arm in comfort, and somehow comfort had turned to passion. Now, weeks into their affair, the guilt was becoming harder to bear, yet neither seemed able to stop. They justified their actions in countless ways. Gary wasn't getting enough emotional support from Arabella. Bronwyn was still fragile from her divorce. They hadn't meant for it to happen. But beneath all the excuses lay the simple, ugly truth. They were betraying someone who loved them both unconditionally. The days fell into a pattern. Arabella would leave for work, her heart full of love for her attentive husband and gratitude for her supportive sister. Behind her, Gary and Bronwyn would share knowing looks, their day's rendezvous already planned through secret text messages and coded conversations. In the evenings, Gary's attention to Arabella became almost theatrical in its intensity. He showered her with gifts, jewelry, perfumes, silky lingerie. Each present was an act of penance, each passionate night an attempt to absolve his guilt. Arabella, still blissfully unaware, interpreted these gestures as signs of deepening love. The apartment itself became a maze of secrets. The guest room where Bronwyn stayed held hidden evidence of Gary's visits, a forgotten cufflink under the bed, the lingering scent of his cologne on her sheets. The living room couch had witnessed countless stolen kisses while Arabella was in the shower. Even the kitchen counter, where they prepared family meals together, had become a stage for their secret touches and meaningful glances. Gary's construction business provided the perfect cover for their meetings. He could claim client meetings, site inspections, supplier negotiations, all legitimate reasons for his absences. Bronwyn's flexible waitressing schedule meant she could easily match her free time to his invented appointments. The web of lies grew more complex with each passing day. They created fake phone calls, manufactured emergencies, invented social engagements, anything to carve out time for their stolen moments. The deception became a full-time job, requiring constant attention to maintain their elaborate facade. But beneath the surface of their passionate affair, cracks were beginning to show. Bronwyn sometimes caught Gary looking at Arabella with genuine love, and jealousy would twist in her stomach. Gary occasionally felt overwhelmed by the constant need to maintain his double life, the strain showing in moments of distraction or irritability. The upcoming cochlear implant surgery added another layer of complexity to their deception. Both Gary and Bronwyn realized that once Arabella could hear, their affair would become infinitely more difficult to maintain. Yet neither seemed able to end it, caught in a spiral of attraction and guilt that pulled them deeper with each encounter. Their lovemaking had taken on a desperate edge, each encounter potentially their last. They came together with an intensity born of forbidden passion and impending doom, their bodies speaking a language of desire and deception. Afterward, guilt would crash over them like waves, but it never lasted long enough to break their cycle of betrayal. In quiet moments, both Gary and Bronwyn would sometimes contemplate confessing everything to Arabella. But the thought of destroying her trust, of shattering her world, always held them back. They told themselves it was kindness that kept them silent, not cowardice, not the addictive thrill of their secret affair. The surgery date grew closer, and with it, their anxiety increased. They began taking greater risks, their need for each other overwhelming their caution. Quick kisses in the hallway when they thought Arabella wasn't looking. Heated encounters in the guest bathroom during family dinner parties. Stolen moments that could have exposed everything. Yet even as their affair intensified, Gary maintained his facade of devoted husband. His nights with Arabella remained passionate, his signs of love seemingly sincere. He had become so adept at compartmentalizing his emotions that he could switch between lover and husband without missing a beat, each role feeling real in the moment it was performed. The truth festered beneath this perfect surface, waiting for its moment to emerge. Like a time bomb ticking away, the revelation of their betrayal was inevitable. But for now, They remained caught in their web of passion and deceit, each stolen moment pushing them closer to the edge of discovery. As summer wore on, the heat in the apartment became almost unbearable, matching the intensity of their secret passion. Air conditioners hummed, masking whispered conversations and stifled moans. The very walls seemed to hold their secrets, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Little did they know that their carefully constructed world of lies was about to crumble. The surgery that would give Arabella her hearing would also give her the truth she never wanted to hear. Their stolen moments were numbered, though they couldn't see it yet, too caught up in their dance of deception to notice the music was about to stop. Chapter 5. Dancing in Darkness. The surgery fund grew steadily as summer deepened into autumn. Arabella took on additional ASL classes at the community center, while Gary claimed to be working overtime at his construction firm. Bronwyn contributed what she could from her waitressing job, though her hours seemed strangely flexible for someone trying to save money. On this particular evening, the Chicago sunset painted the apartment in shades of gold and shadow, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for the drama unfolding within its walls. Arabella sat at their small dining table, carefully counting the week's earnings to add to the surgery fund. Her fingers moved methodically over the bills, each one bringing her closer to a dream she'd held since childhood. What she didn't know was that Gary had just finished a passionate afternoon with Bronwyn in a downtown hotel, their latest rendezvous funded by money skimmed from his supposed overtime earnings. He walked through the door at exactly 6:30 p.m., his timing calculated to match the end of a non-existent client meeting. His shirt was freshly pressed. He kept spare clothes at his office now, another layer of deception in their elaborate charade. The guilt that followed their encounters had begun to manifest in increasingly lavish displays of affection toward Arabella. Tonight, Gary swept into the apartment bearing gifts, a new silk scarf for his wife, its deep purple fabric chosen to complement her dark skin. His hands moved with extra flourish as he signed about his productive day at work, each gesture an attempt to mask his betrayal with enthusiasm. Arabella's face lit up at his arrival, her trust in him still absolute. She reached for him with open arms, and Gary folded her into an embrace that was both tender and tortured. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her familiar scent, trying to ground himself in the reality of his marriage, even as memories of his afternoon with Bronwyn lingered on his skin. Their physical connection had taken on a nearly desperate quality. That night, like many others, their lovemaking was intense and prolonged, as if Gary was trying to prove something, to Arabella, to himself, perhaps to the very walls that held their secrets. His hands traced promises on her skin that his heart couldn't keep, his body speaking a language of love that his actions betrayed. Arabella interpreted his increased passion as excitement about their future together. Each touch, each kiss, seemed to her a celebration of their approaching milestone. The cochlear implant surgery was scheduled for 3 months away, and she imagined their intimacy would only deepen once she could hear his voice, his breathing, his declarations of love. In the afterglow, Gary held her close, his fingers spelling sweet nothings against her shoulder. "You're my miracle," he signed, the guilt making him more eloquent than usual. "Every day with you is a gift." The words were true, even if his actions belied them. In these moments, he almost believed he could end things with Bronwyn, could be the husband Arabella deserved. But Bronwyn had become like an addiction, the thrill of their secret encounters washing away his resolve each time it formed. The next morning, watching Arabella prepare for her classes, he was already anticipating his next meeting with her sister. His phone buzzed in his pocket, Bronwyn, confirming their plans for the afternoon. The sisters' contrasting schedules had become instrumental in facilitating the affair, Arabella's evening classes at the community centre created perfect windows of opportunity, while Bronwyn's flexible waitressing shifts provided convenient excuses for her absences. They had become experts at timing their encounters, at erasing the evidence of their betrayal. The apartment itself had become a maze of memories, both sacred and profane. The kitchen, where Arabella lovingly prepared their meals, was also where Gary and Bronwyn shared heated kisses when they were sure they were alone. The living room couch that held so many innocent family moments had witnessed countless secret caresses. Even the bathroom mirror had seen Bronwyn carefully fixing her makeup after their encounters, while Arabella remained oblivious in the next room. Yet beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, pressure was building. The surgery date loomed like a deadline, adding urgency to Gary and Bronwyn's encounters. They knew that once Arabella could hear, their deception would become infinitely more difficult to maintain. The whispered conversations, the stifled sounds of passion, the late-night phone calls, all would become dangerous in a world where Arabella could hear. The weight of their betrayal began to show in small ways. Gary became more extravagant with his gifts to Arabella, as if material things could somehow balance the moral ledger. Bronwyn's mood swung between exhilarated passion and crushing guilt, especially when Arabella would sign about how grateful she was for her sister's support. Their lovemaking that night was particularly intense, driven by Gary's guilt and Arabella's innocent joy over the growing surgery fund. She arched beneath him, her trust complete, her love unconditional, while he tried to lose himself in the physical sensation, to forget for a moment the web of lies he'd woven around their marriage. Afterward, as Arabella slept peacefully in his arms, Gary stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the day's events. Hours earlier, he had held Bronwyn in a similar embrace, had whispered promises he knew he couldn't keep. The sisters were so different, Arabella all innocence and trust, Bronwyn passion and complexity, yet he found himself unable to let either go. The next morning brought a new challenge. Bronwyn emerged from her room wearing a shirt that Gary recognized. He had torn a button from it in their passion the week before. His eyes fixed on the missing button as Arabella hugged her sister good morning, his heart racing at how close they constantly came to discovery. The sisters shared a quiet breakfast, communicating in the fluid ASL they had grown up using. Gary watched them, his guilt a living thing in his chest. Arabella signed about her excitement for the surgery, about how amazing it would be to finally hear her sister's voice, her husband's declarations of love. Bronwyn's replies were enthusiastic, her signs steady despite the knowledge that her voice had already spoken countless forbidden words to her sister's husband. As autumn progressed, the temperature dropped outside, but the heat of secrets kept the apartment warm. Gary's passion for both sisters seemed to intensify with the approaching surgery date. His nights with Arabella became epic displays of physical devotion, while his stolen moments with Bronwyn took on an almost desperate quality. The surgery fund continued to grow, though more slowly than it should have given their combined incomes. Gary's overtime payments and the money spent on hotels and gifts for Bronwyn created a constant drain that he struggled to hide. He began taking on riskier construction projects, pushing his crew harder, all to maintain the flow of money needed to sustain both his marriage and his affair. One evening, after particularly passionate lovemaking, Arabella lay in Gary's arms, tracing patterns on his chest. She signed about their future, about the children they would have, about how amazing it would be to hear their first words. Gary held her tighter, his guilt threatening to suffocate him. In the guest room, Bronwyn lay awake, listening to the subtle creaks and sighs from the master bedroom, her own guilt warring with her desire. The darkness that enveloped them each night became a metaphor for their situation, Arabella moving confidently through her silent world, while Gary and Bronwyn stumbled through the moral darkness they had created. They were all dancing to different music, Arabella to a song of love and trust, Gary to a discordant melody of desire and guilt, Bronwyn to a bitter symphony of passion and betrayal. As the surgery date grew closer, the tension in the apartment became almost unbearable. Every shared meal was a performance, every family moment tainted by unspoken truths. Gary's touches began to tremble slightly when he signed to Arabella, his guilt making his fingers less sure. Bronwyn's smiles became strained, her signs more hesitant, as if the weight of their deception was finally becoming too heavy to bear. Yet they continued their dance in the darkness, each step taking them closer to the edge of discovery. The truth waited patiently in the wings, knowing that soon Arabella's world of silence would be shattered not just by sound, but by the devastating rhythm of betrayal. Chapter 6. Whispered Lies. The day before her cochlear implant surgery dawned crisp and clear, autumn painting Chicago's skyline in brilliant golds and reds. Arabella stood at their apartment window, watching the sun rise on what she believed would be her last day of complete silence. Her heart fluttered with anticipation, unaware that the gift of hearing would bring with it the sound of shattering illusions. Gary had taken the day off work, claiming he wanted to spend every precious moment with his wife before the surgery. The truth was more complex. He needed these hours to commit to memory the way things were before their carefully constructed world of lies inevitably crumbled. He watched Arabella from their bed, his eyes tracing the elegant line of her neck, the gentle curve of her shoulders, memorizing her in these last moments of innocent trust. Bronwyn had outdone herself preparing a special pre-surgery breakfast. The kitchen counters were laden with Arabella's favorite foods: fresh fruit, homemade waffles, the expensive coffee Gary usually saved for special occasions. Each item was prepared with a mixture of love and guilt, Bronwyn's hands trembling slightly as she arranged everything just so. The three of them sat down to eat together, maintaining the facade of happy family one last time. Arabella's excitement was palpable, her hands flying as she signed about all the sounds she couldn't wait to hear. Rain on windows, music, children's laughter, and most of all, the voices of her husband and sister. Gary and Bronwyn exchanged a glance heavy with meaning, knowing their voices had already shared countless forbidden whispers. After breakfast, Gary suggested they spend the morning in bed, wanting to create one final, perfect memory before everything changed. Arabella agreed eagerly, her trust in him still absolute. Their lovemaking took on an almost ritualistic quality, each touch weighted with significance. Gary's hands spelled out promises against her skin, each one a lie more profound than the last. "You're my only love," his fingers traced on her back. "You're all I've ever wanted," he signed between kisses. "Tomorrow begins our real life together," he promised, as their bodies moved in familiar rhythm. Arabella responded with pure, unconditional love, her movements free from the guilt that made Gary's touches tremble. She believed every silent promise, every gentle caress, every look of adoration. In these moments, Gary almost believed them too, almost convinced himself that he could end things with Bronwyn, could be the husband Arabella deserved. But even as he held his wife, his mind betrayed him with memories of Bronwyn, heated encounters in hidden places, passionate whispers in stolen moments, the thrill of forbidden love that had become as addictive as any drug. The guilt made him more passionate, his touches more intense, as if he could somehow make up for his betrayal through physical devotion. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, friends from the deaf community coming to wish Arabella luck with her surgery. Each guest brought small gifts and big hopes, their hands flying in animated conversation about the miracle of modern medicine. Throughout it all, Gary played the role of devoted husband perfectly, while Bronwyn performed her part as the supportive sister. As the sun began to set, Bronwyn announced she had prepared a special dinner to mark the occasion. The dining room table was set with their best dishes, candles flickering in elegant holders. The scene could have been from a movie about perfect families, except for the undercurrent of tension that only two people at the table could feel. Over dinner, they reminisced about the past, Arabella and Bronwyn sharing childhood memories through fluid ASL, Gary adding his own stories of falling in love with his wife. The sisters laughed about their early attempts to communicate, about the secret signs they'd developed as children. Gary watched them, his heart heavy with the knowledge that they had new secrets now, far more devastating than any childhood code. The food was perfect, each dish chosen specifically for Arabella's tastes. Bronwyn had outdone herself, perhaps trying to balance the scales of karma through culinary expertise. The wine flowed freely, though Gary noticed Bronwyn barely touched hers, her hands too unsteady to risk loosening her grip on self-control. After dinner, as they sat in the living room together, Arabella began to share her hopes for the future. Her hands painted pictures of all the things she wanted to experience with her new ability to hear. Concerts with Gary, long talks with Bronwyn, the sound of rain on windows, the whisper of wind through trees. Each dream she described was another arrow to Gary's conscience, another weight on Bronwyn's shoulders. As the evening wore on, Gary's phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Bronwyn, sent from her spot across the room. "We need to end this, after her surgery." He deleted it without responding, though his eyes met hers briefly over Arabella's head. They both knew it was too late for noble intentions, too late to undo what they had done. The night grew late, and Arabella's excitement began to give way to natural nervousness about the surgery. Gary held her close on the couch, his hands steady as he signed reassurances about the procedure, about the skilled doctors, about the high success rate. Bronwyn added her own encouragement, her signs confident, even as her heart raced with anticipation of what changes tomorrow would bring. When it was time for bed, Gary led Arabella to their bedroom, while Bronwyn retreated to the guest room. The sisters hugged goodnight, holding each other longer than usual. Arabella's embrace was full of love and gratitude for her sister's support. Bronwyn's was tinged with desperate guilt, knowing that tomorrow might be the last time her sister would look at her with such trust and affection. In their bedroom, Gary and Arabella shared one final night of intimacy in her world of silence. His touches were both tender and desperate, each caress a goodbye to the way things had been. Arabella responded with pure love and trust, her movements free from the complexity of guilt that made Gary's hands tremble slightly against her skin. As they lay together afterward, Arabella drifted off to sleep quickly, her body and mind ready for tomorrow's challenges. Gary remained awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tornado of guilt, fear, and desperate hope that somehow everything would work out. In the guest room, Bronwyn lay equally sleepless, tears sliding silently down her face as she contemplated the magnitude of their betrayal. The night wrapped around the apartment like a thick blanket, muffling the sounds of the city outside. In a few hours, Arabella's world would change forever. The silence she had known since birth would be broken not just by the everyday sounds she longed to hear, but by the devastating whispers of betrayal that had been building for months. Gary eventually fell into a troubled sleep, his dreams filled with a cacophony of voices. Arabella's trust, Bronwyn's passion, his own guilt, all screaming for attention. In her silence, Arabella slept peacefully beside him, unaware that tomorrow's gift of hearing would bring with it the sound of her world shattering. Dawn approached slowly, each minute bringing them closer to the moment of truth. The lies they had whispered in darkness would soon be exposed in the light of day. The surgery that was meant to open up a new world of sound for Arabella would instead reveal the discord that had been playing beneath the surface of their perfect life. Chapter 7. Shattered Silence. The experimental cochlear implant surgery had been a success. After months of healing and adjustment followed by weeks of careful calibration, Arabella sat in her living room, experiencing sound for the first time in her 28 years of life. The technician had just left after completing the final adjustments to her implant, leaving her alone to explore her new world of sound. The first thing she noticed was the gentle hum of the air conditioning, a constant mechanical whisper that she had never known existed. Then came the soft tick of the wall clock, each second marking time in her newly acoustic world. These simple, everyday sounds brought tears to her eyes. She had imagined this moment countless times, but reality proved more overwhelming than any dream. The rainfall started softly at first, a gentle patter against the windows that grew steadily stronger. Arabella moved to the window, pressing her hand against the cool glass as she experienced the symphony of water falling from the sky. Each drop seemed to sing its own note, creating a melody that made her heart soar. This was what she had waited for all her life, the music of the world itself. The sudden sound of voices from the next room shattered her reverent moment. "Baby, you know you're the one I really want." Gary's voice, the first time she had ever heard it, slithered through the wall. The tone was nothing like she had imagined during their years together. Instead of the warm, loving voice she had dreamed of, it dripped with a seductive darkness that made her blood run cold. Bronwyn's giggle, a sound Arabella had never heard before, but instantly hated, followed. "What about her surgery?" she might hear us. "She's still adjusting," Gary's voice replied, confident and dismissive. "Besides, she's at therapy today, or so she thinks." The sound of kissing followed, wet and hungry, a sound that should have been sacred between husband and wife, now polluted by betrayal. Arabella stood frozen, her new world of sound becoming a nightmare of truth, her hand pressed against the wall, feeling the vibrations she had always known, now accompanied by the devastating soundtrack of infidelity. "I've missed you so much," Bronwyn's voice breathed. "These past weeks of being careful have been torture." "I know, baby," Gary responded, his voice thick with desire. "But we had to be sure the implant was working right. Couldn't risk her hearing us too soon." The sound of clothing rustling, of breathing becoming heavier, of pleasure building, each new sound was a dagger to Arabella's heart. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear down the wall between them, but her body remained paralyzed. The world of sound she had so longed for had become a prison of painful truth. "What if she comes home early?" Bronwyn asked, her voice breathy with desire. "She won't," Gary assured her. "The therapy sessions always run long, and afterward she usually stops at the community center to practice with the speech therapist. We have plenty of time." More sounds followed, the creak of furniture, the soft thud of bodies moving together, moans of pleasure that would forever taint Arabella's memories of intimacy with her husband. Each sound etched itself into her mind with cruel clarity, her new ability to hear, forcing her to witness every moment of their betrayal. Through the haze of shock, details began to register, the familiar squeak of their marriage bed. How many times had they used it for their betrayal? The rhythm of their breathing. How long had this been going on? The casual intimacy of their conversation. How many times had they laughed about deceiving her? "Remember that first time?" Bronwyn's voice was playful, teasing. "Right here in this bed while she was teaching late classes." "God, yes," Gary groaned. "I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help myself. You were so beautiful, so available. And now you're like a drug. I can't stop, don't want to stop." Their words painted a picture of months of deception, of countless encounters in the very home she had shared with them. The surgery fund she had worked so hard to build, how much of it had gone to fund their betrayal? The late nights at work, the overtime hours, the client meetings, how many had been lies to cover their affair? The sound of their lovemaking grew more intense, their passion building toward its peak. Arabella's legs finally unfroze, and she stumbled backward, away from the wall. away from the sounds that were destroying her world. But in her new audio landscape, she misjudged her movement and knocked over a vase. The crash seemed deafening in her heightened state of awareness. The sounds from the next room stopped abruptly. "What was that?" Bronwyn's voice, now sharp with fear. "Shit!" Gary cursed. "Stay here." The sound of footsteps approaching, how strange that she could hear them now, these harbingers of her husband's betrayal. The bedroom door opened, and Gary stepped into the hallway, hastily buttoning his shirt. He froze when he saw Arabella standing there, her face wet with tears, her hands trembling at her sides. The moment stretched between them, filled with the sounds Arabella had never known before, her own ragged breathing, the pounding of her heart, the distant wail of a siren somewhere in the city. All these new sounds formed a chaotic backdrop to the scene unfolding in their hallway. "Arabella!" Gary's voice, that voice she had longed to hear for so many years, now spoke her name with fear rather than love. You're home early." "Don't." Her own voice surprised her, rough from disuse, thick with emotion, but clear in its anger. "Don't you dare speak to me." Bronwyn appeared in the doorway behind Gary, her hair disheveled, her clothes hastily straightened. The sight of her sister, her own blood, standing there in such obvious evidence of betrayal, broke something inside Arabella. The scream that tore from her throat was primal, a sound born of 28 years of silence and countless months of betrayal. The sound of her scream shocked all three of them, its raw power, its pure anguish echoing off the walls of their apartment. For Arabella, it was the first time she had ever heard herself scream. For Gary and Bronwyn, it was the sound of their carefully constructed world of lies crumbling around them. "How long?" Arabella's voice cracked on the words, each syllable a struggle after years of silence, but her determination pushed them out. "How long?" The silence that followed her question was deafening, and for the first time in her life, Arabella truly understood what that meant. She could hear their guilty breathing, could hear the shuffle of their feet, could hear every damning second that they failed to answer. "Please," Bronwyn finally spoke, her voice small and frightened. "Let us explain." "Explain!" Arabella laughed, and the sound was harsh even to her own new ears. "Explain how my sister and my husband have been fucking in my bed? Explain how you've been laughing at me, playing me for a fool?" The crude words felt foreign on her tongue, but they carried the weight of her rage perfectly. She watched them flinch at her language, at the accuracy of her accusations. The sounds of their discomfort, sharp intakes of breath, nervous swallowing, only fueled her anger. 6 months, Gary finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, since shortly after Bronwyn moved in. The timeline hit Arabella like a physical blow. 6 months, half a year of lies, of betrayal, of mockery, all those overtime hours, all those late-night meetings, all those casual touches she had dismissed as innocent. Every memory now tainted by the knowledge of their deceit. "While I was saving for this surgery," she gestured to her implant, her voice growing stronger with each word. "While I was working extra classes, dreaming of hearing your voices, you were using that time to betray me." The sound of traffic outside, of neighbors living their normal lives, of the city continuing to move forward, all of it created a surreal soundtrack to this moment of devastating truth. Each new sound seemed to mock her, to remind her that the gift of hearing had brought with it the curse of knowledge. "Get out." The words came out clear and strong, surprising even herself with their authority. "Both of you, get out of my house, now!" The sounds that followed would be forever etched in her memory. The hurried gathering of clothes, the frantic footsteps, the desperate attempts at explanation that she silenced with a raised hand, the slam of the front door as they left. Her first experience of that particular sound felt like an exclamation point at the end of her marriage. Left alone in the apartment, Arabella sank to the floor, finally allowing herself to fully experience the symphony of sorrow that surrounded her. Her sobs echoed off the walls, strange, gasping sounds that she had never heard before. The rain continued outside, its gentle rhythm now seeming less like music and more like nature's tears joining her own. The silence she had known all her life had been shattered, not just by the gift of sound, but by the brutal truth it had revealed. As she sat there, surrounded by the acoustic evidence of her solitude, the hum of electronics, the tick of the clock, the occasional car horn from the street below, Arabella realized that some silences were easier to bear than the sound of betrayal. The day she had dreamed of, the moment she had worked so hard for, had become a nightmare of discovery. But as the sun set outside her window, casting long shadows across her tear-stained face, a new sound began to emerge from deep within her, the sound of determination, of anger crystallizing into resolve. The silence of her past had been broken, and with it, the chains of her trust in those who had betrayed her. The world of sound had revealed its cruel truths, but it had also given her a voice she would now use to demand justice, to express her rage, and ultimately to reclaim her power from those who had abused her trust. Chapter 8. The Storm Breaks. Arabella's first spoken words were not the joyful expressions of love she had planned, had practiced, had dreamed about for months. Instead, they erupted from her chest in a primal scream of rage as she burst into the bedroom, catching Gary and Bronwyn in their betrayal. The sound of her own voice, raw, powerful, filled with pain, reverberated off the walls, creating an acoustic backdrop to the scene of devastation before her. The look of horror on their faces would have been almost comical if it wasn't so tragic. Gary scrambled to cover himself, his mouth forming excuses that Arabella could now hear, but wished she couldn't. The sound of rustling sheets, of panicked breathing, of stammered explanations. Each new noise added another layer to the symphony of betrayal playing out in their bedroom. "How could you?" The words came out rough and unpracticed, but the emotion behind them needed no polish. "My own sister, my husband." Bronwyn sat frozen on the bed, clutching sheets to her chest, tears streaming down her face. The sound of her sister's quiet sobs, a sound Arabella had never heard before this moment, felt like acid in her ears. Gary stood between them, his body tense with the instinct to protect, though which woman he was trying to protect remained unclear. "Arabella, please," Gary's voice, that voice she had longed to hear for so many years, now dripped with guilt and fear. "Let me explain." "Explain?" The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "Explain how long you've been fucking my sister in our bed? Explain how you used my disability to hide your betrayal? Explain how you both laughed at me behind my back?" The sound of her own anger surprised her, the way her voice rose and fell, the way emotion colored each word with different tones. She had never known that rage could have its own melody, that betrayal could sound like breaking glass in a human throat. "It wasn't like that," Bronwyn finally spoke, her voice small and trembling. "We never meant to—" "Shut up!" Arabella screamed, and the force of it made them both flinch. "You don't get to speak, not now, not after what you've done." The chaos that followed played out like a discordant symphony. Drawers slammed as Arabella began pulling out Gary's clothes, throwing them at him with violent force. Each impact made a different sound: soft thuds of fabric, sharp clacks of belt buckles, the rattle of hangers torn from the closet rod. The acoustic texture of destruction fascinated some distant part of her mind, even as she continued her rampage. "Get out!" She hurled the words at them along with another handful of clothes. "Get out of my house!" The sound of their scrambling, feet on hardwood floors, hasty zipping of pants, quick gathering of scattered possessions, created a frantic percussion beneath her continued screams. Bronwyn tried to approach her, one hand extended in supplication, but Arabella's reaction was instantaneous and violent. The slap echoed through the apartment, another first sound for Arabella, the sharp crack of palm against cheek. The physical shock of it froze them all for a moment. Arabella had never struck anyone before, had never heard the sound of flesh meeting flesh in anger. The moment stretched between them, filled with harsh breathing and the distant sound of city, traffic filtering through the windows. "Arabella!" Gary tried again, reaching for her, but she backed away from his touch as if it were poison. "Don't you dare!" she spat, her voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. "Don't you dare try to touch me with hands that have touched her." The sound of her own venom shocked her. She had never known she could make her voice carry such hatred. Years of speech therapy had prepared her for communication, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, for the way emotion could transform sound into weapons. "How long?" she demanded again, her voice steadier now, but no less intense. "I want to know exactly how long you've been betraying me." The silence that followed her question was deafening, and for the first time in her life she truly understood that phrase. She could hear their guilty swallows, their nervous shifting, the subtle sounds of two people trying to decide how much truth to tell. 6 months, Gary finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, since shortly after Bronwyn moved in. The timeline hit her like a physical blow, forcing the air from her lungs in a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. 6 months, half a year of lies, of betrayal, of mockery. Every memory of that time now replayed in her mind with a new soundtrack. The sound of their deception playing beneath every moment she had thought was filled with love. "The surgery fund," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "How much of it went to hotel rooms, to gifts for her, to funding your little affair?" Their guilty silence was answer enough. The realization that her dream of hearing had been delayed by their betrayal sparked a fresh wave of rage. She grabbed the nearest object, a framed photo of their wedding day, and hurled it at the wall. The sound of shattering glass was satisfying in a way she had never expected, the tinkling of fragments hitting the floor like wind chimes of destruction. "I worked extra classes," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "I saved every penny. I trusted you both, and all that time—" The tears came then, hot and bitter, accompanied by sounds she had never heard before. Her own sobs, raw and painful, echoing off the walls of what had once been her sanctuary. The acoustics of grief were entirely new to her, the way sorrow could shape sound into something physical that filled a room. Bronwyn made another attempt to approach, her own face wet with tears. "Sister, please." "Don't!" Arabella's voice cracked on the word. "Don't you dare call me sister! You lost that right the moment you decided to fuck my husband." The crude words felt foreign on her tongue, but carried the weight of her rage perfectly. She watched them flinch at her language, at the accuracy of her accusations. The sounds of their discomfort, sharp intakes of breath, nervous swallowing, only fueled her anger. "Get your things and get out," she ordered, her voice dropping to a cold, controlled tone that surprised even her. "Both of you, now." The next 30 minutes were a symphony of departure. Drawers opening and closing, closet doors sliding, zippers being pulled, bags being packed. Arabella stood in the living room, arms crossed, watching as they gathered their belongings. Each sound was another nail in the coffin of her marriage, her sisterhood, her trust. Gary tried one last time to reach her as he headed for the door. "I do love you, Arabella. It wasn't all a lie." The laugh that burst from her throat was harsh and bitter, another new sound to add to her growing vocabulary of pain. "Love? You don't know the meaning of the word. Get out before I call the police and let them explain it to you." The sound of the door closing behind them was both devastating and liberating. Arabella stood in the sudden silence of her apartment, surrounded by the acoustic aftermath of destruction, the hum of the air conditioning, the tick of the clock, the distant sound of their footsteps retreating down the hallway. Then, slowly, deliberately, she began to destroy every reminder of their betrayal. The sound of breaking glass became a percussion section in her symphony of rage. Wedding photos shattered against walls, wine glasses exploded on the floor, mirrors cracked under her fists. Each new sound of destruction taught her something about the physics of pain, about the way emotion could be translated into acoustic energy. Blood from her cut hands left dark patterns on the hardwood floor. She could hear it dripping, soft, rhythmic drops that eventually slowed her frenzy. The pain in her hands was sharp and real, a physical counterpoint to the emotional agony that threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, exhausted and bleeding, she sank to the floor in the midst of the destruction. The sounds of the city continued outside her windows. Traffic and sirens, voices and music, the endless rhythm of life moving forward. Her own breathing gradually steadied, the sound of it filling the space where love had once lived. As the sun set outside her window, casting long shadows across the wreckage of her life, Arabella became aware of a new sound rising from deep within her, the sound of determination. The silence of her past had been broken not just by technology, but by betrayal. Yet in that breaking, she had found her voice. A voice that would now demand justice, that would speak her truth, that would never again be silenced by trust in those who didn't deserve it. The storm of discovery had broken, leaving behind a landscape transformed by truth and pain. But in the aftermath, as she listened to the steady beat of her own heart, Arabella knew that this was not the end of her story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. One where she would learn not just the sound of betrayal, but the even more powerful sound of her own strength. Chapter 9. Rising from Ashes. Arabella moved out of the apartment that same night, taking only what she needed. The sound of her suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floors echoed through the empty rooms, a rhythmic reminder of her exodus from what had once been home. Her best friend from the deaf community center, Jasmine Williams, had immediately offered her guest room when Arabella called, her own voice still shaky, but growing stronger with each word. The drive to Jasmine's apartment on the north side of Chicago was filled with new sounds that Arabella barely registered: the purr of the car engine, the whoosh of passing traffic, the subtle click of the turn signal. Her mind was too busy replaying the sounds of betrayal she had discovered mere hours ago, each remembered word and moan like a knife twisting in her heart. Jasmine was waiting outside her building when they arrived, her familiar face etched with concern. She had always been more than just a colleague at the community center. She had been the one who first noticed Gary's wandering eyes, who had tried to warn Arabella in subtle ways that she had chosen to ignore. "I should have listened to you," Arabella spoke, her voice cracking with emotion. The sound of her own words still felt foreign to her, like listening to a stranger speak from inside her head. Jasmine's response was both signed and spoken, a habit from their years of friendship. Don't do that to yourself. This is not your fault." The guest room became Arabella's sanctuary as she began the process of rebuilding her life. In the weeks that followed, she worked tirelessly with her speech therapist, channeling her pain into determination. Her first complete sentence, "I want a divorce," was practiced over and over until it could be delivered with perfect clarity and unwavering strength. The sounds of healing surrounded her in Jasmine's home. The gentle bubbling of coffee brewing in the morning, the soft rustle of newspapers being read, the quiet conversations that helped her adjust to her new audio world. Each day brought new discoveries, both beautiful and painful. The sound of children playing in the park across the street reminded her of the family she had planned with Gary. The ring of her phone made her flinch, wondering if it would be him or Bronwyn trying to explain again. 28 days after discovering the affair, Arabella walked into the offices of Maya Thompson, a divorce attorney known for handling high-profile betrayal cases. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor of the law office lobby created a rhythm of determination. She had chosen this particular morning deliberately, exactly 4 weeks since her world had shattered, enough time to ensure her voice would be steady when she told her story. Maya Thompson's reputation was well earned. The attorney sat behind her massive desk, her dark skin gleaming in the morning light, her expression shifting from professional interest to righteous anger as Arabella recounted her story. The sound of Maya's manicured nails tapping against her desk punctuated key points of the narrative. "Let me get this straight." Maya's voice was rich with controlled fury. "Your husband and sister were using your surgery fund to finance their affair, while you were working extra hours to save for the procedure." Arabella nodded, her own voice stronger now after weeks of practice. "They took advantage of my silence, used it to hide their betrayal." "Oh, honey," Maya leaned forward, her eyes glinting with determination. "We're going to make them wish you had never heard their lies. Your disability wasn't a weakness. It's going to be the cornerstone of our case for punitive damages." The legal strategy took shape over the next several hours. Maya's voice filled the office with confidence as she outlined their approach. The misuse of the surgery fund would be their primary angle, along with the emotional distress of discovering their betrayal at such a vulnerable moment. The fact that they had deliberately used Arabella's disability to conceal their affair would play heavily in their favor. "We'll need to gather evidence," Maya explained, the sound of shuffling papers accompanying her words. "Bank statements, credit card records, hotel receipts, anything that shows they were using joint funds for their affair." Arabella had come prepared. She pulled out a USB drive containing months of financial records she had meticulously gathered. The sound of Maya's appreciative whistle made her smile for the first time in weeks. "You've done your homework," the attorney noted with approval. "Now, tell me about your marriage. When did you first notice changes in Gary's behavior?" The next few hours were spent reconstructing the timeline of betrayal. Arabella's voice grew stronger as she spoke about the subtle signs she had missed or dismissed, the late nights at work, the mysterious expenses, the growing intimacy between Gary and Bronwyn. Each remembered detail was another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of her marriage. Maya's assistant brought lunch, and they continued working through the afternoon. The sounds of their strategy session filled the office, papers rustling, computer keys clicking, voices rising and falling as they built their case. Arabella found herself drawing strength from these new sounds, from the purposeful rhythm of justice being prepared. "There's something else," Arabella said, as the day drew to a close. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. "The day I discovered them, my implant's adjustment app was running. It makes automatic recordings to help with calibration. I have audio of their confession." The sound of Maya's sharp intake of breath was followed by a predatory smile. "Play it." The recording was crystal clear. Gary's admission of the affair's duration, Bronwyn's guilty attempts at explanation, the raw emotion in Arabella's own voice as she confronted them. The sounds filled Maya's office, painting a vivid picture of betrayal and discovery. "This," Maya said when the recording finished, her voice thick with satisfaction, "this is going to destroy them in court." The sun was setting by the time they finished their initial consultation. Maya walked Arabella to the elevator, their heels clicking in sync against the marble floor. "We're going to win this," the attorney assured her, "and not just win. We're going to make an example of them." Back at Jasmine's apartment, Arabella sat at the window, listening to the city at night. The sounds of traffic had become familiar now, a constant reminder that life moved forward even after betrayal. Her phone buzzed with another text from Gary, the fifth today, but the sound no longer made her flinch. Instead, it strengthened her resolve. The next few weeks were filled with the sounds of preparation, meetings with financial advisors, consultations with forensic accountants, sessions with her speech therapist, to ensure her voice would be strong enough to testify in court. Each day brought new challenges but also new victories. She returned to teaching at the community center, her voice now adding a new dimension to her ASL lessons. The sound of her students' applause when she spoke their names for the first time brought tears to her eyes, happy tears this time, tears of triumph rather than pain. Gary's attempts to contact her grew more desperate. The sound of his voicemails changed from apologetic to angry to pleading, but Arabella never responded. Instead, she saved each message, adding them to the growing pile of evidence Maya was accumulating. Bronwyn tried once to visit the community center, but Arabella's new voice proved powerful enough to send her running. The sound of her sister's retreating footsteps was sweetly satisfying, a percussion line in her symphony of revenge. The legal proceedings began to take shape. Maya's team uncovered a pattern of financial deception that went beyond the surgery fund. Gary had been siphoning money from his construction business, money that should have been joint marital property, to fund his affair with Bronwyn. Hotel receipts, jewelry purchases, secret bank accounts, each discovery was another weapon in their arsenal. "They thought your silence made you weak," Maya observed during one of their preparation sessions. "They never imagined your voice would become their undoing." Arabella's voice had indeed become a powerful instrument. In practice sessions for her testimony, she learned to modulate it for maximum impact, when to speak softly for emphasis, when to let emotion color her words, when to maintain strict control. The acoustics of justice, she discovered, required as much practice as any other skill. As the court date approached, Arabella found herself spending more time at the window of Jasmine's apartment, listening to the city below. The urban symphony that had once been foreign to her had become a comfort, a reminder that she was no longer living in silence, neither acoustic nor emotional. Her phone rang late one evening, Gary again, but this time she answered. The sound of his voice, once so desired, now held no power over her. "Arabella, please," he begged. "We can work this out. I'll do anything." "Save it for court," she replied, her voice clear and strong. "I look forward to hearing you explain everything to the judge." The sound of the call ending was decisive, final. Arabella smiled, remembering how she had practiced that particular phrase with her speech therapist, ensuring each word would cut like a blade. The night before the first court date, Arabella stood before her mirror, practicing her testimony one last time. The sound of her own voice, confident, unwavering, powerful, reflected the woman she had become. The betrayal that had shattered her world had also freed her voice, and she intended to use it to full effect. "I am Arabella Blossom," she spoke to her reflection, each word perfectly enunciated. "And tomorrow the world will hear my truth." The city sounds drifted through the window, sirens and music, laughter and traffic, the endless urban lullaby that had become the soundtrack of her new life. Tomorrow would bring new sounds, the rap of the judge's gavel, the rustle of legal papers, the damning playback of evidence. But tonight, she simply listened to her own heartbeat, strong and steady, keeping time with her determination. The silence of her past had been broken not just by technology, but by betrayal. Yet from that breaking had emerged a voice of power, of justice, of unwavering strength. Tomorrow that voice would begin to tell her story in a court of law, but the victory had already been won in the moment she first chose to speak her truth. Chapter 10. The battle begins. The morning of the initial divorce hearing dawned clear and cold, the Chicago winter adding a brittle edge to the air. Arabella stood before the courthouse steps, the sound of her heartbeat steady in her ears, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Maya Thompson stood beside her, a protective presence in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. "Remember," Maya's voice was low and confident, "today is about establishing the foundation of our case. Let them reveal their weaknesses. We have the evidence, we have the truth, and most importantly, we have your voice." The courthouse buzzed with activity, a symphony of footsteps, whispered conversations, and the echoing sound of justice in motion. Arabella absorbed each new sound, adding them to her growing acoustic vocabulary. The click of her heels against the marble floor created a rhythm of determination as they made their way to the courtroom. Gary was already there with his attorney, Richard Davidson, a man known for defending wealthy clients in high-profile divorces. The sound of Gary's sharp intake of breath when he saw her was satisfying. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a deep burgundy suit that made her dark skin glow and projected both power and dignity. Bronwyn sat in the gallery, her presence not legally required, but clearly intended to show support for Gary. The sisters' eyes met briefly, and Arabella noted with satisfaction that Bronwyn was the first to look away. The sound of her sister's nervous fidgeting carried across the courtroom, a subtle percussion of guilt. Judge Victoria Chen entered, the traditional all rise calling them to their feet. The sound of shuffling papers and creaking chairs filled the room as everyone settled back down. Arabella studied the judge, a woman in her 50s with elegant silver streaks in her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. "We're here today for the initial hearing in the matter of Blossom versus Kirsten." Judge Chen's voice was crisp and authoritative. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings, and I must say, this case presents some unique elements. Mrs. Blossom Kirsten's recent cochlear implant surgery and the circumstances surrounding her discovery of the alleged affair are particularly noteworthy." Maya rose smoothly to her feet. "Your Honor, if I may, we have evidence that goes beyond mere allegations. The defendants used Mrs. Blossom Kirsten's disability to conceal their affair, deliberately taking advantage of her inability to hear their interactions." Richard Davidson stood as well, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man used to defending the indefensible. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges poor judgment in his personal affairs, the characterization of deliberate exploitation is excessive and inflammatory." The judge's gavel cracked sharply, another new sound for Arabella to catalogue. "Save the arguments for trial, counsellors. Today we're here to establish temporary orders and set a timeline for proceedings." Maya was prepared, presenting a detailed timeline of the affair, complete with financial records showing misuse of joint funds. "Your Honor, we have documentation showing that Mr. Kirsten diverted money from the fund specifically designated for Mrs. Blossom Kirsten's cochlear implant surgery to finance his affair with her sister." The sound of murmurs from the gallery suggested this revelation had hit its mark. Judge Chen's eyes narrowed as she reviewed the financial statements Maya presented. "Furthermore," Maya continued, her voice carrying just the right note of controlled outrage, "we have audio evidence of Mr. Kirsten and Ms. Bronwyn Blossom discussing their deliberate use of Mrs. Blossom Kirsten's disability to conceal their relationship." This caused a stir in the courtroom. Gary's face paled visibly, while Bronwyn seemed to shrink in her seat. The sound of their discomfort was music to Arabella's ears. Davidson attempted to object. "Your Honor, any recordings made without my client's knowledge or consent were made by a medical device during its normal calibration process," Maya smoothly interrupted. "The cochlear implant's adjustment app automatically records audio to assist with device calibration. The recording in question was made during a routine adjustment session, during which Mr. Kirsten and Ms. Blossom chose to engage in inappropriate behavior." Judge Chen leaned forward, interest clear in her expression. "I'd like to hear this recording." The next few minutes were filled with the damning sound of Gary and Bronwyn's own voices, their casual discussion of exploiting Arabella's disability echoing through the courtroom. The recording captured every word of their betrayal, including their explicit acknowledgement of using her therapy sessions as cover for their encounters. Arabella kept her eyes fixed straight ahead as the recording played, but she could hear Gary shifting uncomfortably in his chair, could hear Bronwyn's muffled sob from the gallery. The sound of their guilt was sweetly satisfying. When the recording finished, silence filled the courtroom, a silence Arabella could now fully appreciate. Judge Chen removed her glasses slowly, her expression stern. "Mr. Davidson, do you care to respond to this evidence?" The defense attorney cleared his throat, the sound betraying his discomfort. "Your Honor, while the recording is unfortunate, it doesn't change the fundamental aspects of this divorce proceeding. My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement." "Generous?" Arabella's voice rang out clear and strong, surprising everyone, including herself. "Is that what you call it after stealing from my surgery fund to finance your affair with my sister?" "Mrs. Blossom Kirsten," Judge Chen's voice held a note of sympathy beneath its authority. "While I understand your emotion, please allow your counsel to speak for you." Maya smoothly took control again. "Your Honor, my client's point is valid, if passionately expressed. Mr. Kirsten's offer of settlement deliberately overlooks the criminal nature of his actions. He didn't just commit adultery, he committed financial fraud, using jointly owned funds for his personal affair while actively delaying his wife's medical procedure." The judge nodded slowly. "I'm inclined to agree that this case involves more than standard divorce proceedings. Mr. Davidson, your client's actions, as evidenced by both the financial records and this recording, suggest a level of calculated deception that this court cannot ignore." Gary leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney. The sound of their hushed conversation carried to Arabella's newly sensitive ears, fragments of panic and desperation that made her smile inwardly. Davidson stood again. "Your Honor, my client is willing to revise his settlement offer." "No." Arabella's voice was firm and clear. She had practiced this moment with her speech therapist, ensuring each word would carry the weight of her conviction. "I don't want his settlement. I want justice." The sound of her voice, strong, unwavering, determined, filled the courtroom. She could hear the rustle of movement as people leaned forward, could hear the subtle intake of breath from the gallery. This was why she had worked so hard with her therapist, why she had practiced each word until it was perfect. This moment of truth needed her voice to be as powerful as her resolve. Judge Chen studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Blossom Kirsten, am I correct in understanding that you wish to proceed with a full trial rather than accept a settlement?" "Yes, Your Honor." The words came out clear and strong. "I want everything exposed in court. Every lie, every betrayal, every dollar they stole from my surgery fund. I want it all on record." The judge nodded slowly. "Given the evidence presented today, particularly the financial records and audio recording, I'm granting the temporary orders requested by plaintiff's counsel. Mr. Kirsten will maintain all financial obligations regarding the marital home and Mrs. Blossom Kirsten's medical expenses, but he is barred from accessing any joint accounts pending trial." The sound of Maya's pen scratching against her legal pad was triumphant. Gary's attorney started to object, but Judge Chen wasn't finished. "Furthermore, given the nature of the evidence suggesting deliberate exploitation of Mrs. Blossom Kirsten's disability, I'm ordering a full forensic audit of all accounts associated with Mr. Kirsten's construction company. If there's evidence of systematic financial fraud used to finance this affair, this court will take a very dim view of it." The rest of the hearing passed in a blur of legal terminology and scheduling details. Arabella remained focused and alert, noting how Gary seemed to shrink with each new ruling, how Bronwyn's nervous movements became more pronounced as the judge's decisions consistently favored the plaintiff's requests. As they left the courtroom, Gary tried to approach her. "Arabella, please." She turned to face him, her voice carrying clearly in the courthouse corridor. "Save it for trial, Gary. I look forward to hearing you explain everything under oath." The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked away was perfectly steady, a rhythm of triumph. Maya walked beside her, their steps in sync, the sound of victory echoing through the courthouse halls. Outside, the winter sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Arabella paused at the top of the stairs, listening to the city sounds around her, traffic and voices, footsteps and sirens, the endless urban symphony that had become the soundtrack of her new life. "First blood," Maya said quietly beside her. "They never saw it coming." Arabella smiled, the expression both beautiful and fierce. The battle had indeed begun, but she already knew how it would end. She had found her voice, and she would use it to full effect. The silence of her past had been broken not just by technology, but by betrayal. Now, that betrayal would be exposed in all its ugly truth, with every word clearly heard and recorded for posterity. The war for justice was just beginning, but today's victory was sweet as the sound of Gary's confident facade crumbling in the face of irrefutable evidence, as sweet as the sound of Bronwyn's guilty tears in the gallery, as sweet as the sound of her own voice speaking truth to power. Chapter 11. Justice Speaks. The evidence mounted like an unstoppable tide, each new revelation adding weight to Arabella's case. Bank statements, hotel receipts, text messages between Gary and Bronwyn dating back months. Maya Thompson's team had uncovered a trail of betrayal so comprehensive it left no room for denial. But the most damning evidence was still to come. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation on the morning Maya presented their secret weapon, the audio recording from the day Arabella first heard their betrayal. The technology that had given her the gift of hearing had also provided irrefutable proof of their deception. The recording, automatically made by her cochlear implants adjustment app, would prove to be the cornerstone of their case. Arabella sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture perfect, her expression composed. She could hear the whispers in the gallery behind her, the rustle of newspapers reporting on what had become a sensational case. The story had captured public attention. A deaf woman, whose first experience of sound was discovering her husband's betrayal with her own sister. Gary entered the courtroom, looking haggard, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. The sound of his expensive shoes against the marble floor was unsteady, matching his apparent state of mind. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but Arabella could see from their body language that the relationship between client and counsel had become strained. Judge Martinez called the court to order, the sound of her gavel now familiar to Arabella's ears. Maya rose smoothly, her voice carrying clear authority as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, we would like to present audio evidence recovered from Mrs. Blossom's cochlear implant calibration system." The courtroom fell silent as the recording began to play. The initial sounds were mundane, the hum of electronics, the soft patter of rain against windows. Then came the voices that had shattered Arabella's world. "Baby, you know you're the one I really want," Gary's voice, dripping with desire. "Arabella was just convenient. You know that." Bronwyn's giggle followed, then her concerned whisper. "What about her surgery? She might hear us. She's still adjusting. Besides, she's at therapy today. Or so she thinks." The recording continued, capturing their intimate moments, their casual dismissal of Arabella's feelings, their calculated deception. The sound of their betrayal filled the courtroom, made more powerful by being heard in this formal setting. Several jurors visibly recoiled at the callousness displayed in the conversation. Gary's reaction to hearing himself was dramatic. He seemed to physically shrink in his chair, the sound of his shallow breathing audible in the silent courtroom. His attorney's attempts to object were overruled. The recording had been legally obtained as part of medical device calibration. But Maya wasn't finished. She proceeded to present a detailed timeline, matching the recording's timestamp with bank records showing withdrawals from the surgery fund, hotel receipts, and credit card statements for jewelry purchased for Bronwyn. The pattern of deception was laid bare in meticulous detail. "Your Honor," Maya's voice cut through the tension. This was not a simple case of infidelity. This was a calculated exploitation of a disabled woman's trust, using her own disability as cover for their affair, while simultaneously depleting funds meant for her medical care. The financial evidence was particularly damaging. Gary had systematically used their joint accounts to fund his affair, even as Arabella worked extra hours to save for her surgery. The construction company's records revealed a pattern of misappropriated funds, all carefully documented by Maya's forensic accountants. During a brief recess, Arabella encountered Gary in the courthouse corridor. His attempt to approach her triggered an unexpected surge of anger. "You were better off deaf," he shouted, his frustration finally breaking through his carefully maintained facade. "At least then you were grateful for my love." The gallery gasped. The judge's expression darkened. Gary's attorney winced. And Arabella? Arabella smiled, knowing this outburst had sealed their victory. When court resumed, Maya called an unexpected witness, the technician who had calibrated Arabella's cochlear implant. His testimony described the standard recording procedure for device adjustment, establishing the legitimacy of their key evidence. He also spoke about Arabella's dedication to her speech therapy, her determination to make the most of her new ability to hear. "Mrs. Blossom was one of our most committed patients," he testified. "She worked tirelessly to prepare for the surgery, even taking extra teaching assignments to save money faster." The contrast between Arabella's dedication and Gary's betrayal was stark. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, added another brick to the wall of justice being built. The jury's sympathies were clearly with Arabella. She could see it in their expressions, hear it in their murmured reactions to particularly damning revelations. Gary's defense began to crumble under the weight of evidence. His attorney's attempts to paint Arabella as opportunistic fell flat in the face of documented financial abuse. The suggestion that she had somehow orchestrated the recording to trap them was dismissed by expert testimony about the implant's automatic calibration features. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Maya presented evidence that Gary had been planning to leave Arabella once the surgery was paid for, having manipulated her into covering the majority of costs, while he secretly funneled money into a separate account shared with Bronwyn. "Your Honor," Maya's voice rang with controlled fury, "we have evidence that Mr. Kirsten was planning to abandon my client once she had paid for her own surgery, leaving her with depleted savings while he started a new life with her sister. This level of calculated cruelty demands more than a simple division of assets." The judge's face showed rare emotion as she reviewed the evidence. The sound of papers being shuffled seemed to echo in the tense courtroom. When she looked up, her expression was stern. "Mr. Kirsten," she addressed Gary directly, "in my years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated betrayal of trust. Your actions show a pattern of exploitation that this court cannot ignore." Gary's attempt to speak in his own defense was cut short by his attorney, but the damage was done. The sound of whispers in the gallery grew louder, forcing the judge to call for order. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, recording every damning moment. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Arabella stood in the courthouse corridor, listening to the echo of justice in motion. The sounds that had first revealed her husband's betrayal had now become instruments of her vindication. Each footstep, each whisper, each closing door added to the symphony of her triumph. Maya joined her, their heels clicking in sync against the marble floor. "Tomorrow," the attorney said with quiet confidence, "we end this." Arabella nodded, her voice steady and clear. "Tomorrow, justice speaks." The sun was setting as they left the courthouse, painting the sky in shades of victory. The city sounds that had once been so new to Arabella now felt like old friends. Car horns, distant sirens, snippets of conversation, all telling the story of life moving forward. Her new world of sound had brought pain, but it had also brought truth, and with truth came power. Chapter 12. Resonant Victory. The courtroom fell silent as Arabella rose for her final statement. The morning light streamed through the high windows, creating a natural spotlight as she took her position. Her voice, though still carrying traces of someone who had lived most of her life in silence, rang clear and strong through the hushed chamber. "Your Honor," she began, her words measured and deliberate, "I've lived in silence for 28 years. In that silence I built a career, earned respect, and foolishly gave my heart to a man who confused my inability to hear with an inability to see, think, and feel." She turned slightly, allowing her gaze to sweep across the gallery where Bronwyn sat, tear-stained and trembling, before settling on Gary. "I want to thank my husband and sister for their betrayal." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. "Yes, you heard me correctly," Arabella continued, her voice gaining strength, "because their betrayal taught me that silence comes in many forms. There's the silence of being deaf, which I lived with proudly for 28 years. Then there's the silence of lies, of secrets, of betrayal, the silence they chose to live in." Tears began to fall in the gallery as she spoke, her words touching something deep in everyone present. Even the court reporter paused briefly to wipe her eyes. "When I first heard their voices through that wall, I thought my world was ending. But I was wrong. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Their betrayal gave me something precious, my voice. Not just the physical ability to speak, but the courage to speak up, to demand justice, to tell my truth." She focused directly on Gary now, her voice unwavering. "You thought my silence made me weak. You saw my disability as an opportunity for deception. But here's what you failed to understand. My years of silence made me strong. They taught me to observe, to understand, to see truth in actions rather than words." Turning to face the judge, Arabella stood straighter, her presence commanding the room. "I stand here today not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a woman claiming her power. Every penny they stole from my surgery fund, every lie they told, every moment of mockery and betrayal, it all led to this moment where I can stand before this court and say, I am Arabella Blossom, and I will not be silenced again." By now, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the bailiff was discreetly wiping tears away. The judge herself had to take a moment to compose herself before speaking. "Mrs. Blossom," Judge Martinez's voice was thick with emotion, "in my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely been so moved by a statement of truth and dignity." The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Gary's assets were to be split, with the court taking special consideration of Arabella's contributions to the household and her medical expenses. His construction business, built partly with her savings and support, would be sold and divided. The court also awarded substantial punitive damages, citing the calculated nature of the betrayal and the exploitation of her disability. But the most powerful moment came when the judge addressed Gary directly. "Mr. Kirsten, You used your wife's silence as a weapon against her, never imagining that sound would become your undoing. The court finds your actions particularly reprehensible. You didn't just betray your marriage vows, you betrayed the trust of someone who lived in a world of silence and still chose to love you loudly. As the gavel fell for the final time, sealing the judgment, Arabella felt tears rolling down her cheeks, not tears of pain or loss, but of triumph. The sound of applause erupted spontaneously from the gallery, a thunder of support and admiration that filled the courtroom, despite the judge's calls for order. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to hear her speak. Television cameras captured the moment as Arabella, standing tall in the autumn sunlight, delivered her message to the world. To every person who has ever been underestimated, betrayed, or silenced, your voice matters. My silence wasn't my weakness, it was my strength. And now that I can speak, I choose to speak for those who still struggle to be heard. Months later, Arabella stood before a packed auditorium at the Chicago Deaf Community Center. The building had been renovated using part of her settlement money, transformed into a state-of-the-art facility for deaf education and empowerment. As she addressed the crowd, speaking and signing simultaneously, her voice carried the confidence of someone who had found their true power. Silence and sound are both gifts, she told her audience, many of whom were crying openly, but the greatest gift is truth. My journey from silence to sound taught me that the loudest voice isn't always the strongest. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that breaks free from silence to speak its truth. In the front row, her former students watched with pride as their teacher demonstrated what real strength looked like. Among them sat several women from the domestic violence shelter where Arabella now volunteered, teaching sign language and sharing her story of empowerment. Gary and Bronwyn had moved away, their relationship crumbling under the weight of guilt and mutual distrust, but Arabella bloomed like her namesake, her life filled with new possibilities and genuine love, starting with love for herself. The silence in her life had been broken not just by sound, but by truth. And in that truth, she had found her real voice, one that would never be silenced again. The sound of applause filled the auditorium as she concluded her speech, but it was the sight of tears in her audience's eyes, the feeling of hearts being touched and lives being changed that told her she had truly won. Her victory wasn't just legal or financial, it was the triumph of truth over deception, of strength over betrayal, of voice over silence. And as she stood there, bathed in the love and admiration of her community, Arabella knew that her story would continue to resonate, touching lives and inspiring others to find their own voice, whether in silence or in sound. Subscribe if you enjoyed.